Okay, this is lecture 1 for life sciences. So lecture 1, we're looking at the history of Western science. This is part 1, in which we're looking at the ancient Greeks. So let's take a quick look together at our objectives. And we're not actually getting through all of these objectives today, but here's what they are. Chart on a timeline significant ages and events that contribute to the evolution of Western scientific thinking, including the ancient world, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the modern world, the period of Aristotelian physics, and the period of Newtonian physics. Designate general positions on a timeline of major contributors to the evolution of Western scientific thinking, including Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Archimedes, Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, and Einstein, and list the main contributions of those listed above. So this is part 1, which means the first and second objectives, maybe like we're just doing the first parts of those, and then we should have them completed in part 2. Okay, so let's start out taking a look at this timeline to kind of orient ourselves here a little bit. So this timeline is actually, it is an art timeline. So in ancient times, art and architecture and science were all very closely related, which is why this kind of relates. But we're going to leave this timeline and look at one that's more specific for our purposes in a moment, but this was a nice one that kind of laid things out in a clear way, I thought. So notice the dotted line that's toward the left side of the timeline. That's the division between ancient times and the Common Era. So to the left of that is BCE, before Common Era. So that's the ancient, like ancient Greece and Rome is in that time, the Antiquity. And then to the right of that dotted line is the Common Era, CE. So that's where we get into Middle Ages and the Renaissance and up to modern times. So let's look at, okay, let me just say, so that line, that dotted line, is kind of like year 0, which of course is not a real thing, but it is that dividing point between the ancient world. Well, it's more or less the dividing point between the ancient world and the modern world. But let's look at our timeline here. So what we're really looking at here is a timeline of Western scientific thought. That's what we want to follow through time. If you'll look at the notes, there's a quote there by Winston Churchill. History is written by the victors. So what did Churchill mean by that? He meant that history, what we know of history, may or may not be what really happened. What we know of history is what the winners of any conquest have left behind for us to know or to understand. And so our quest through history is tricky. Any quest through history is tricky because it's hard to know for sure what happened. It's hard to know for sure who said what and why and that kind of thing. And it's also difficult for us to view historical happenings as a person of that time would have viewed it. We can, when we look back through history, we are necessarily looking through the lens of our own experience, of our own culture, of the things that have shaped us. And that is not necessarily the same lens that people were living through in those ancient times. They had different priorities, different ways of thinking, different ways of problem solving in some cases, and in some cases things were very much the same. So anyway, all we can do when we're looking at history is do the best that we can. Historians do the best that they can to recreate ancient times or other times in the past, and so we will do our best to do the same. But specifically, what we're looking at when we are looking back in time here is not so much who said what and what happened when and that kind of thing, but more we want to trace the path of Western scientific thought, and we want to kind of watch how that process of that thought evolves over time. So if we look at the timeline here in front of us, we're going to see that magic non-existent year 0 on the left side of that blue line across the middle of the of the screen. And so if we look up from that 0, we see Aristotelian physics. We'll get back to that in a minute, or maybe in quite a while. And then if we look up and to the right of that, we see the fall of the Roman Empire. So the fall of the Roman Empire is said to occur around 400 Common Era, and that actually is when things shift from ancient world to the more modern world. But there are 400 years there from that 0 to the fall of the Roman Empire that are, sort of transitioning from the ancient world to more common times, or more recent times. Okay, but today what we're looking at, or in lecture 1, what we're looking at is basically the entire left side of this timeline. If we look across the top, what we see is on the left we see the ancient world and before Common Era, and that recedes further to the left. To the right, then we see the Middle Ages, we see the Renaissance, and then we see the modern world. So those are marching into the future to the right there. And down below the line, we see some ancient Greeks. So we see Hippocrates, we see Socrates, we see Plato and Aristotle, and we see Archimedes. So of those, in this lecture, we are looking at the 4 ancient Greeks that are on the furthest left on the chart. So Hippocrates, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So let's take a look at these guys. All right, look at this. This is school in ancient Greece. So this is not what school looks like today, but there are some interesting things we see here, and we will come back to this diagram. But the 2 characters we see in the middle of this tapestry are Socrates and Plato. So Socrates and Plato are considered very central in the whole development of philosophy. And so to know what that means, what philosophy even is, let's look at who Socrates and Plato were, and other folks who hung out with them and debated with them. So, I guess I don't have it on the slides, but it is in your notes. And so, let me find it here in the notes. Okay, so letter B in the notes, which is on the top of page 2, starts with the ancient Greek thinkers and a definition of the word Sophia. So Sophia, as lovely of a name as it is, in Greek means wisdom. So the sophists were people who sought out wisdom. And so philosophers were lovers of wisdom. That's what philosopher means. One who loves wisdom. And so the sophists were kind of a category of ancient Greek teachers and thinkers and philosophers who traveled, taught, and debated. They provided the only higher learning that was available at the time. So at the time, for instance, when Socrates was around teaching, and before him, the way that education worked is that people who could afford a tutor to come to teach their sons, and it was their sons and not their daughters who were getting educated, would pay for a tutor to come and stay at their estate for a while. And so, of course, the word estate, the word tutor, all of this sort of implies that these are the wealthy people. So only the wealthy people could afford education. So these were people with land and homes and servants, etc., extensive enough that they could afford to have a teacher come and stay with them for a number of months and train their youngsters. And so the types of things that the sophists traveled and taught included music and poetry and mathematics and philosophy and medicine and physics and other things. And basically these were young statesmen. These were children and teens who were destined to go into politics or to be in charge of large areas of land, or be merchants that were in charge of significant trading, that kind of thing. Those were the people who got an education. But the sophists themselves, those were the teachers. And so Socrates is one of our best known sophists. And he had a very specific way of teaching, and had a significant appeal to his students. So Socrates is known as the father of Western philosophy, and so we see him here. Here's a quote by Socrates: "I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think." So Socrates felt very strongly about free thinking. He did not want his students to take his word for anything. He wanted his students to question their own thoughts, their own beliefs. He wanted them to question whatever belief he maybe had, or whatever he was, posing for them to think about. He wanted them to question everything. And so at the time, language was the way that anybody conveyed anything to anyone, for the most part. Things were written down somewhat, but if we were going to teach something, if somebody was going to learn something, it happened in an oral tradition. And so language was what was used to convey ideas. Socrates was somewhat dissatisfied with language because he felt like debates could be won with trickery, or debates could be won simply by the person who was most eloquent, but maybe not by the person who was most correct, or the person who was most charismatic, but not necessarily the person who was most correct. And so Socrates was very much about wanting to get to the truth of matters. And so he wanted to be able to set aside any sort of trickery or charisma or things like that that language could be used for, and just sort of boil things down to their essence. And so one of the things he really valued was mathematics, because he felt like mathematics was something that you couldn't lie with. No matter what, 1 + 1 = 2. You couldn't debate that 1 + 1 = 3. It just defied logic, and he liked the cleanliness of that. And so he liked to try to turn what he was talking about into logic, where it could be so clear like that, and not debatable. Well, it's debatable, but it's, the idea is that if a statement is made and is based in logic, it's undeniable, and that's what he's after, the undeniable truth. So what Socrates developed was a method of posing questions, and rather than teaching his students things, he would question them, because he believed that anybody who took a minute to think about something could figure out as much truth about it as they had, based on the knowledge that they had. And he wanted his students to think. He didn't want them to just take his word for it and just memorize things. And so from that developed what we call the Socratic method. And so the Socratic method and Socratic questioning is at the heart of critical thinking. There are 6 types of Socratic questions. And to bring this into modern times, the Socratic method is basically what it's the foundation of the scientific method. The scientific method is what we use to develop and research our ideas scientifically. So what is the Socratic method? So we have a few different types of questions, 6 different types of Socratic questions. There are questions for clarification, and an example of that is, why do you say that? So if you want somebody to give more information or clarify what they're saying, you might ask them, why do you say that? There are questions that probe assumptions. What could we assume instead is an example of that. Socrates understood that people made assumptions about things, and so he wanted them to question their assumptions and examine their assumptions. And so he would ask them to try a different assumption instead and see where that took them. There are also questions that probe reason and evidence, and so an example of that is, what would be an example? Or what is your evidence, or something like that. There are questions about viewpoints and perspectives. So an example is, what would be an alternative? So we want to, examine anything that we believe to be true, or anything that we're examining. We want to look at it from another perspective and see if we can create another truth about it, which may unseat the original truth that we thought we knew about that topic. And then there are questions that probe implications and consequences, such as what are you implying? So again, similar to, what perspective are you taking, but also, but this is, what are you implying? What are you saying by saying what you're saying? What's at the core of what you're saying is what that question asks. Or if you're saying something, then what is the consequence of that? What does that lead to? Those types of things are probing implications and consequences. And then the sixth type of Socratic question is questions about the question, such as, what is the point of this question? So not only do we question everything that we think that we believe, we also question why we're questioning and why we're asking specific questions. What are we trying to get to by asking a specific question? So those are the 6 types of Socratic questions. And here's an example of the Socratic method. So Socrates says, "Excuse me, Athenian, can you tell me the color of the sky, please?" And the student says, "Yes, the color of the sky is blue. Can't you see for yourself?" Socrates says, "I can see fine." So, is the sky blue to a blind person? Student, I don't know how they would know. Socrates, so the sky is blue only to people who can see it? Student, I guess so. Socrates, if nobody looks at the sky, then does that mean it's still blue? Student, well, yes, it is still blue. Socrates, how is the sky blue for those who can see it, but yet not blue for those who cannot see it? Student, because the color blue exists in our mind as a result of our perception. So that last statement that the student makes is what Socrates was trying to get the student to understand in the beginning, that the color blue exists in our mind as a result of perception, and that the color blue is not a thing that exists outside of ourselves. It is only our perception of it that makes it so. But he asks the student a series of questions to get the student to come around to understand that for himself. Because Socrates saw that when someone had their own idea and their own clarity about something, that it was far more meaningful to them than if a teacher just told them this is how it is. So Socrates is known as the father of Western philosophy. He developed the Socratic method, which the scientific method has come from, and we still use today, like in debate and things like that. We'll use Socratic questioning to try to get at the core of what we believe to be true. And so the similarity between the Socratic method and the scientific method is that both of them use a process of elimination. We eliminate what we know not to be true, and the idea is we're trying to whittle down everything that we can remove so that we can whittle down to what is true, or what we think is true, or what is as true as we can possibly get based on what we know. And that is essentially what the scientific method aims to do too. It aims to disprove things. It aims to say, well, we know this isn't true, we know this isn't true, we know this isn't true, therefore this remaining evidence, or therefore, what remains here must be true until we come up with some other idea that then can prove to us that what we now believe is actually not true. So it's a process of elimination to get down to the truth of matter. Okay, let's see what else about Socrates. So Socrates was eventually put on trial for corrupting the youth because he was asking his students to think for themselves, God forbid. So, but people in positions of power do not really like people to think for themselves. They're more difficult to control. And to get them to do what you want when they're thinking for themselves. And so politicians at the time were like, this is not going to do. We need to stop all this free thinking that Socrates is promoting. And so he was put on trial for corrupting the youth in 399 BCE. He was found guilty because he pled guilty. He said, absolutely, I am doing this. I am encouraging people to think for themselves. And he felt like that was the only thing he could do, is say, yes, that is what I'm doing, so that he could stand up for free thinking, which is what he felt so strongly about. So he pled guilty. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. And so he, he drank poison hemlock, and that was the end of Socrates. So that's what this picture is depicting: is Socrates in jail there drinking hemlock and ending his own life by doing so. Okay, on from Socrates, next is Plato. So Plato was a student of Socrates, and I think it's interesting that what we have, much of what we have of these ancient sophists are marble statues of them, because of, the Socratic method is this method of removing what is not true from what we know, and what remains then we can assume is true. And so that's very much like creating this marble statue. We remove from the marble what does not look like Plato, or what does not look like Socrates, and so then what remains must be their image. So it's kind of an interesting connection between a marble statue and the Socratic method. Okay, Plato. So Plato was a student of Socrates, and it is actually through Plato's writings that we know as much about Socrates as we do. He wrote extensively about many topics, politics and philosophy and love and mathematics and science and rhetoric and ethics and on, logic. And those writings very much are still around today and used at universities today when people are studying these topics. Plato, one of the issues that he had with what was going on in Athens, in ancient Greece at the time, was that he felt like education should be available to everyone. He did not like this idea of the teachers, the sophists, traveling from one estate to another and staying there for a while and teaching. He felt like not just the wealthy should be getting this education, but anybody should be getting an education. So Plato founded the first institution of higher learning in the Western world in Athens. It's called the Platonic Academy of Athens, and it's just known as the Academy. So if you travel to Athens today, you can see you can see the site of it and the ruins of what was there on that site where the first university was established. Plato is well known for his teaching on ethics, so he felt strongly about the virtues. So for Plato, the virtues were wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice. And he felt like living with these, or by these virtues, is what would bring one to happiness and to well-being. And happiness and well-being was the highest quest for life. And so the way to get there was by living by the virtues. And so that was kind of the core of his ethics that he developed. And let's see, he also developed a clear idea of what an ideal society would look like. So that had three tiers of people, the uppermost being the guardians, who were the philosophers who ethically governed the city. The middle tier are the auxiliaries, who are soldiers who defend the city. And so that kind of speaks to Athens at the time, ancient Greece at the time. There was a lot of feuding and warring and battling over land. Any area kind of had either a major or a minor god that was sort of in charge of it, that people of that area paid tribute to. And so then there was always this quest, well, our God is better than your God, but really that was sort of the guise, for the politicians to say, hey, let's take over that land, and let's invade that area and show that our God is superior to their God. And anyway, so there was a lot of warring kind of times. So you can see that in Plato's ideal of a city or a community, that there are these people who ethically govern, that oversee things, but then there are people who defend it. So you can see that there was a lot of defending needing to happen at that time. And then there were the producers, that's the third tier of people. And the producers are like the day-to-day folks, the farmers, the artisans, the people who wove cloth, the people who who grew food, the people who took care of animals, raised them and slaughtered them, and that kind of thing, and those were the producers. Let's see, what else about Plato? And okay, so here we're back to that original diagram. So this is supposed to be what the Platonic Academy of Athens looked like. So this is, this beautiful marble building that's just ornate and gorgeous, and all of these people are standing around or sitting around or laying around debating. And debating and teaching and learning and pointing things out to each other and questioning, and so this is kind of this ideal. What's curious to me is it seems in this diagram that there are a couple of women here and there, but that I may be wrong about that. See, here's what I think. I think this person in white seems like a woman. And maybe that spoke to Plato's feeling that everyone should be allowed an education, even though at the time really it was only men receiving education. Anyway, so that's the Platonic Academy of Athens, founded by Plato. Okay, on to Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato's and went on to be a professor at the academy. He eventually went on to found his own school. He split with Plato's thinking, and which was pretty consistent with Socrates' thinking in a couple of ways, and that happens as ideas evolve, so that's fine. So let's see. So Aristotle, let's see what's key about Aristotle. He actually did a lot to develop the foundation of physics. He applied this Socratic questioning and thinking to the natural world around him, and not just to the physical world and the movements of it, but also to living things. And so he established the beginning of physics and the beginning of biology. But what's important about this, about applying the Socratic method and Socratic questioning to biology or to living things and to the physical world, is that that kind of took the happenings of the physical world out of the hands of the gods. And that's a lot of what the sophists were doing. The sophists were saying, hey, we can figure this stuff out. We don't have to say, oh, lightning struck because Zeus was mad, or the crops failed because Hera, I don't know, I might be using the wrong gods and goddesses, but, the crops failed because, Hera was upset about something or whatever. They can say, hey, we can figure out why weather happens. We can figure out these things. We can observe the world. We can question things, and we can figure things out for ourselves. And so they were the sophists in general were the significant shift from believing that everything that happened was in the hands of the gods and happened because it was the will of the gods, to believing that things happened for some understandable, definable reason. And so Aristotle observed, movement of the physical world, and we'll look at his physics here in just a second. But in observing that, he had these four kind of fundamental ideas in his physics that he developed. But kind of foundational to those four parts of his philosophy on physics was that somewhere in the movements of the physical world, there was an unmoved mover. There was, something that made these things happen that wasn't acted on by itself. So that unmoved mover, Aristotle called God, and that he called God with a capital G. So this was the beginning of capital G God and the beginning of the end of small g gods and goddesses. And, but of course changes like that take time to take hold. But this was, this was important, and this is an important shift in science too. And we're going to see this shift continuing to happen even, as we move into the Renaissance here. But, so into more modern times. But kind of taking the physical world and the happenings, the observation of it and the happenings of it, and coming up with explanations of it, is the scientists saying, we're going to take this into our own hands. We're going to come up with our explanations, and we're going to figure this out. We're not going to just say, oh, it's this mysterious, all-powerful being that is doing these things. So he did come up with, Aristotle came up with these 4 parts of physics. But what's interesting about that, a couple of things. So the Aristotelian physics, if we go back to our timeline, way at the beginning, we see that Aristotelian physics in green there on the left was what was being taught from about 300 BCE to about 1543 Common Era. So that is close to 2,000 years that Aristotelian physics was like the physics being taught. And so what's interesting about that is Aristotelian physics, he had these 4 things, these 4 fundamental ideas, and he taught them, and it was kind of like, this is it, and which was also the beginning of a shift away from Socratic thinking, because Socratic thinking or Socratic questioning isn't about coming up with a body of something that we then teach and pass on to every generation as truth. It's about asking every thinker to question that. And but Aristotle kind of began to end that by saying, boom, this is what's true. And I've done a lot of thinking on it myself, and so this is it. And I'm not kidding. So that was Aristotle. So anyway, he taught for many years and wrote a lot. Here are the 4 parts of his of Aristotelian physics. One is that he believed that everything had a natural place. Part of this idea of natural place was that everything had a form of its fulfillment, and so living things, biological things, obeyed this by growing into their fulfillment. So for instance, like an acorn grows into an oak tree. So it may appear as if it's defying gravity, although gravity was completely not an idea that he had. But it's moving upward, which seems like not its natural direction, but it was obeying this idea of natural place. It was coming into its fulfillment as an oak tree. And any living thing would do that, would grow and mature and come into its natural place. But within this idea of natural place also, things had a natural place. So the natural place for fire is up in the sky. So we could see the stars and go, look, those are these fiery things, and they're up in the sky, up in their natural place. And when we burn fire, the flames go upward, because up into the sky is the natural place for fire. Whereas like rocks, metal, sand, earth kind of things, their natural place is the earth. So if we pick up a rock and we drop it and it falls back down to the earth, it's because it's returning to its natural place. Okay, so these were some observations he made and ways that he had to explain them. So natural place was the first one. Second one was impetus. So impetus meant essentially that you could take something out of its natural place and you could put some power into it and get it to do something else. So a living organism can put impetus into an inanimate object to move it in some direction other than toward its natural place. But when that impetus is gone, the object will return to its natural place. So a person could pick up a rock and throw it, and as long as that impetus is there in the rock will continue in the direction that it's been thrown. But once that impetus wears off, the rock will then plummet to the earth and return to its original place, or its natural place, which is the first law of his physics, natural place. The third one is force. So force is this idea that a force is required to keep an object moving. When the force is removed, the object stops moving, and so that kind of explains impetus. So a living organism putting its impetus into something, so somebody throwing a rock, we're putting force into that rock. But again, when that force is removed, the object stops moving. And then the last part of his physics was a geocentric system, meaning that the Earth does not move, the sun, planets, and stars move around the Earth. Okay, so these were ideas that he came up with by observing the natural Earth, or the natural world. And we have since essentially scrapped all of these ideas, but that is beautiful Socratic thinking. When something else can replace an idea then and make that idea not true, well, then the new idea is the one that becomes true. Okay, so, well, nothing is really true. It's only not false until we know that it is false. All right, what else here? So let's see, biology and physics. Okay, I think that's it for Aristotle. Let's move on to Hippocrates. So Hippocrates, let's zoom back to that timeline one more time here. Hippocrates, if we notice, he comes before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were all more or less contemporaries of each other. Hippocrates was before them. So sophists were around and, observing the world and learning about things and teaching people, etc., well before Socrates came along. Socrates just applied his method of questioning to this idea of sophism. So, sophism, we're after wisdom. That's the most important thing. And Socrates kind of, came along with this questioning and said, "Oh, here's how we can know that we know what we think we know is by, using this method to figure things out." So anyway, Hippocrates actually predates these guys that we've been talking about so far. And Hippocrates, you probably recognize his name. He is the father of Western medicine. And so some ideas, so he was a sophist though as well. And so ethics and morality and, that sort of thing were very important to him. But also by applying sophist thinking to medicine, he did that same thing that these other sophists did, in that he removed the idea of disease from the hands of the gods and put it into the hands of the physician or the patient. And so he believed that any disease, we could figure out that any disease had a cause. It wasn't just a god or a goddess being upset or being random, and striking somebody down. A disease happened for a reason. And if we could figure out that reason, then we could cure the disease or get rid of the disease. And so this was strongly putting responsibility into the hands of the physician and into the hands of the patient to follow the physician's advice. He believed that, and so he's credited with saying things such as all disease begins in the gut, and he made that observation time and time again. And he would said, "Let food be thy medicine." And so his primary method of treatment was through lifestyle changes. He used herbs and things like that, but he also would counsel people on changing how they were eating or drinking. There was plenty of alcohol being consumed, and plenty of other foods that some were better for some people and not so good for other people and whatever. But so he would counsel people in those lifestyle kinds of things to improve their health. And he would also use hands-on techniques, massage and that kind of thing. In the notes, there's a painting of Hippocrates examining a young patient, and you can see that his hands are on that young patient. He's palpating and he's trying to figure out what's going on, or maybe he's trying to help things along by doing the palpation and massage that he's doing. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so another key thing that Hippocrates is all about is the ethics specifically of a physician, and from that comes the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath is still taken today by physicians. You as graduates will take the Hippocratic Oath, and the Hippocratic Oath promises ethical living. If you can read this, you can read it. Ethical living, gentle, compassionate care for all. He felt strongly about everyone deserving health care, not just people who could afford it, or not just wealthy people or people of high status, but all people, servants and even women, that all people deserved compassionate health care. And also, physicians at the time, like teachers at the time, went into the homes of people to see them. And so he felt like it was very important for physicians to behave ethically there. So number one, that they weren't going to touch inappropriately or engage in inappropriate relationships with anyone in the home when they went in to treat someone. And also they would not speak of anything that they saw or heard in the home when they were there treating patients. So So these are the kinds of things that we still see in medicine today. The privacy that a patient has, and those sorts of things. We could see those ideas way back in ancient Greece. And there was something else I was going to say about. Also the other thing that he felt like was the duty of every physician was to pass on his knowledge of medicine to the next generation, so that things would not be lost, and so that each generation could continue to build on the knowledge of the previous generation. So, so that's Hippocrates. So that takes us into modern definitions of different fields of science. So we can see at this point some of the beginnings of our modern fields of science. We can see the beginnings of physics, we can see the beginnings of biology, and chemistry maybe not so much. In a way, yes, but chemistry, we haven't completely, if we're looking just at ancient Greece, we haven't completely developed a way to observe things on a chemical level. But physics and biology, we can observe those things, so we can see the beginning of those sciences developing here. So let's take a look at these 4 fields of Western science that are relevant to the study of medicine. And these are the 4 fields that we are going to look at in life sciences. We're going to spend some time discussing each of these 4 fields. So the first is physics. Physics involves the study of matter and its motion through space and time. We are going to look at, in part 2, we'll look at more physicists and this amazing evolution from Aristotelian physics to Newtonian physics and beyond that over the course of a few thousand years. So physics involves the study of matter and its motion through space and time, along with related concepts such as energy and force. So in general terms, it's an analysis of nature conducted in order to understand how the universe behaves. So eventually we'll see a lot of mathematics attached to physics, and physics is held in very high regard as a science because it is considered to be the most empirical of the sciences. It is the science that can be turned into mathematics most cleanly. And if we go back to Socrates' idea and his love of math, because of the logic implied in it, that you can't lie with numbers the way that you can with words, that takes us to why physics is considered to be this very high level of science, because it's very empirical. Although that has evolved considerably with newer fields of physics, but that's in Aristotelian, well, not so much Aristotelian, but Newtonian physics, that's certainly the case. So that's physics. The next one is inorganic chemistry. That's one branch of chemistry. The other is organic chemistry. So inorganic chemistry is the study of the structure and behavior of atoms and molecules, and the synthesis and behavior of non-carbon-based compounds. So we will make more sense of these definitions as we get into chemistry. Organic chemistry is the study of the synthesis and behavior of carbon-based compounds. Okay, so inorganic chemistry, we're looking at non-carbon-based compounds. Organic chemistry, we're looking at carbon-based compounds. So these are compounds that are, by and large, larger, significantly larger compounds, and these are the compounds that make up living things. Whereas organic chemistry, yes, we have, inorganic chemistry, yes, we do have it in living things, but we also have it in non-living things. And then the last field of science that we're going to touch on is biology. Biology is the study of life and living organisms, including their structure, their function, their growth, their evolution, and their taxonomy. So when we're studying anatomy and physiology, for instance, we are studying an aspect of biology. So that basically concludes lecture 1. So what does that mean for you? That means you have some homework. So here's your homework. I want you to write a brief response to the questions below. The questions are these. Number 1, who were the sophists? Okay, so if you go back into your notes and take a look at who the sophists were, not necessarily their names, but what they believed and what was important to them, what they taught. So who were the sophists? And the second question is, what are 1 or 2 major contributions of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Hippocrates? So these are 4 of our sophists that we looked at. And we want to know what are 1 or 2 of their major contributions. for each of them, and those contributions that have aided the development of modern scientific thinking. So you're going to email your responses to me at jprovidence@asum.edu, and once I receive that, boom, you are done with your homework for lecture 1. Don't stay tuned, you can do your homework and then go on to lecture 2. And lecture 2, we're going to pick up where we left off here and continue this this path through history, picking up with still some ancient Greek thinkers, but then we're going to move into the Renaissance. Okay, so I will catch up with you, I guess, on the next video. Thanks for listening.